Good evening, everyone, and welcome to OTF Connects, the January edition, chilly January in the province of Ontario. My name is Susan Watt. I'm a retired educator in the Waterloo region, and this is what I do in my part-time. So I'm really excited to welcome all of you here. We have a great group of early years educators here tonight. We already have over 50 in the room, and we're all here excited to hear a little bit about pedagogical documentation, highlighting the learning in kindergarten. And Joel Seaman is our presenter tonight. Joel's an experienced presenter. However, this is his first time with OTF Connects, so a really warm welcome to Joel. I have to just tell them, Joel, I hope it's okay. Joel's and my paths have crossed in the past. In fact, Joel was I used to teach music, and Joel was one of my music students when he was in, I think, grade 4, 5, or 6, or maybe all three of them, a number of years ago. So I'm really thrilled that our paths have reconnected, and here we are at OTF Connects. Anyway, we're excited to have you here, all of you, and certainly Joel. So I'll turn my mic off now and turn things over to him. Welcome.
Hi, everybody, and welcome tonight. As Susan said, my name is Joel Seaman, and I'm going to be facilitating our webinar tonight. Before I get started, I want to thank Susan, not only for that lovely introduction, but of course all her help along the way. As she mentioned, this is my first webinar with OTF Connects, and I'm very much looking forward to learning alongside all of you tonight, and I want to thank you all for being here. A little bit more about me to provide some context for tonight's learning. I've been teaching for 6 years with the Toronto District School Board, and I teach at the school on Toronto Island. So it does mean that I take a boat to and from school. It makes for a pretty unique commute, but given the location of our school, we're presented with lots of opportunities for outdoor learning, and it's a super inspiring place to be. For the 6 years I've been teaching, I've been lucky enough to have been in kindergarten for all of that time, and I really mean it when I say lucky enough to be in kindergarten. For me, kindergarten is the place to be. I know tonight I'm probably preaching to the choir in a room full of kindergarten educators, but for me, kindergarten is just magical, such an inspiring and special place to be, and working with those young students and setting up a love for learning is something that I really enjoy doing. So tonight's topic is pedagogical documentation, which is a very big idea in early years right now, and for a very good reason, many of which we will be talking about tonight. It's my hope that tonight, in our hour and a half together, we at least skim the surface of this big idea, and that we all walk away with some ideas, some thoughts, and perhaps even some wonders. I do like to start any presentation I ever give by acknowledging the fact that I don't claim to be an expert on this topic. In fact, I feel very strongly that there is actually no such thing as an expert in the field of education. You know, for me, what makes this field so exciting is that things are always changing, and there's always more for us as educators to learn and new perspectives to take. So tonight, again, I'm simply here to talk about what has worked for me in my journey, in my practice, and with the students I've worked with. But keeping that in mind, I recognize that we are a room full of knowledge and expertise, and it's really my hope tonight that we hear from multiple voices. I think you would agree with me that engaging in a dialogue tonight is going to be more valuable than me talking at you for 1.5 hours straight. So as Susan indicated, there is the chat box. I'm hoping to see lots of you taking part in that. Give me a little hello or hi in the chat box if you're going to be following along there. Hello, Jessica. Hi, Amber. Here we go. And perhaps some of us may even be brave enough to turn our microphones on. There's lots of opportunities for conversation to happen tonight. And again, I'm really hoping to hear from all of you because we all are full of the knowledge and expertise. I'm going to flip over to the next slide. Hello, everyone in the chat. Thank you so much. Bonjour, Sandra. Awesome. Keep it up. I'm really hoping to hear from all of you tonight. I like to start presentations with a quote. It allows us kind of a minds-on opportunity and a chance to focus our thinking for the evening. So this one comes to us from the great Loris Malaguzzi, and it says, "Stand aside for a while and leave room for learning. Observe carefully what children do, and then, if you have understood well, perhaps teaching will be different from before." And one of the many reasons I chose this specific quote to start our night off talking about pedagogical documentation is, for me, it highlights that engaging in pedagogical documentation is not only deeply beneficial to our students, but also us as educators. It allows us to think very carefully and potentially even transform our practice. I'm going to ask all of us now to think about our own current learning journey towards the concept of documentation in kindergarten and the early years. And I use the term learning journey very specifically because, as I've mentioned, I think whether you've been in the field for 1 year or 100 years, there's always more to learn, and we're always on a journey of sharpening our own thinking around topics. So I've presented you with 4 images of roads. We have A, which is the winding road. We have B, which is a straight road. C, which is under construction, and D, which is a roundabout. I want you to think which image best describes your current learning journey towards the understanding of documentation in kindergarten. You can type A, B, C, or D in the chat, and perhaps even let us know a little bit around your thinking behind why you chose that option. Ooh, someone's putting a sticker on there. That's good too. I love it. Lots of A's and C's. Okay, lots of winding roads, under construction. That's good. That's very good. I hope to always be under construction. Melanie, A and B, winding road and roundabout. Monica, C, always learning, always growing, always changing. I love that. A, just when I feel like I've got it figured out, I hit a curve. Awesome. Oh, I like that. D, so many different ways I've learned about documentation. Never a wrong way to turn, can go around it different ways. I like that. I myself, when I look at this, tend to go to the roundabout. For me, it's the idea that we're always revisiting these thoughts. And for me, there's, maybe something I thought worked once and perhaps did work once with a certain group of students. And then another year comes around and you look at things a little differently. So I've always gravitated towards the roundabout. I'll give a few more minutes if anyone's hoping to respond in the chat. Awesome. Thank you guys for taking part. I really appreciate hearing all of your voices tonight. We're going to take a quick overview of the presentation to give us an idea of where we're headed tonight. We'll start by discussing the idea of what is documentation, but more importantly, what makes documentation pedagogical. We're going to talk about some context. Why is this idea so important? We're going to talk about what might it look like, and I'll be providing some examples from my own practice. Again, I'm hoping to hear from all of you on what has worked for you. We're going to look at some considerations for pedagogical documentation, things that we all want to be mindful of as we move forward. We'll look at how we connect our documentation to the 4 frames of learning that we find in the Ontario kindergarten program. And we're going to end with a video exercise. It's my hope we can actually view a video all together and consolidate our knowledge from tonight by actually taking part in the act of TED Doc all together. We start with the big question, what is documentation? And there's a few different answers here. The Ontario kindergarten program refers to it as making children's thinking and learning visible. To me, it's capturing the very real moments of learning that we know present themselves naturally and authentically in our purposeful, play-based learning environments. As we'll see tonight and explore a little bit further, the idea of documentation and the act of documentation can take on many different forms. Something that comes up a lot as we discuss documentation is what makes it pedagogical. For me, I think about moving beyond simply gathering and collecting this documentation, but towards a more thoughtful analysis and interpretive stance of what thinking and learning and understanding might be taking place in these captured moments. I think about myself on my early journey of documentation. I would be collecting just piles and piles and piles of handwritten notes of everything the kids said, and I was collecting it, but I would find it would sit on my desk and I would have this massive stack of paper, not really sure what to do with it. So the shift came for me when I started to realize that documentation goes beyond that. We think about making it pedagogical, and we're analyzing the data we're collecting. We're interpreting the things we see and hear in our classrooms, and we're using it to inform our practice. Pedagogical Documentation Revisited is a really great monograph. It's put out by the Ministry of Education, and you can access it online. It's linked towards the end of the slideshow. And they refer to discussing the wonderings we have about the documentation, the inferences they are making from it, and where they need to go next in the learning. So it's this idea of a cycle. Something I hear a lot and has really resonated with me is the idea that pedagogical documentation is not just about finding answers, but uncovering more questions. And yes, Natalia, I feel you with the Post-it notes. I've got them everywhere. I actually have a teacher at my school, and her sister works for 3M, and she just brought us giant Post-it notes. They're probably 8 inches by 8 inches, and I'm using them for everything in the classroom now. It's a little plug for them. On the next slide, we're going to think a little bit more about what makes documentation pedagogical. And something that we really need to think about as we move forward is that the act of PedDoc is really strengthened when multiple lenses take part in that process of analyzing the learning. As we'll see tonight, we all notice different things when we're noticing and naming learning in play. And when I say we, I'm not just referring to our educator teams, but also the students themselves, and very importantly, their families. The Ontario Kindergarten Program defines pedagogical documentation as the process of gathering and analyzing a wide range of evidence of a child's thinking and learning over time, and using the insights gained to make the child's thinking and learning visible to the child and the child's family. The process enables educators to support further learning for each child in the most effective way possible. So it goes beyond simply collecting that data, like I said, my example of having that stack of notes, but really analyzing and using it to inform our practice. I've always loved the idea, and I put it there at the bottom, of teacher as researcher. I'm loving to see in the chat that people are sharing their own styles of documentation. OneNote is a great app. I've heard awesome things about it. Or to those of you who are using OneNote, I see about 3 of you now. Is that something that you found useful? Oh, Karen, I love that. Sesame. Yeah, and there's Seesaw as well. Google Keep. That for me, I want to look at Google Keep. Great. To me, what this is highlighting, and I mentioned it a bit earlier, and it will come up again, is that there's not, an expert way to document. You find what works for you, and I love this. Google Keep in Docs. Okay. Neat. Seesaw, yeah. It's great. It's really highlighting the fact that there's more than one way to document. There's more than one method. I'm going to flip to the next slide here, and this is an example that I like to show that really differentiates between note-taking or just simple documentation and moving towards pedagogical documentation. This comes from the Ontario program. As you all know, you can access it online, and this is something, I'm not going to read it to you, but I love the 2 examples it gives, moving from traditional note-taking to pedagogical documentation. You can have a look at the slide now and start to notice the differences you see between the 2 options. Something I really like in the second example is you see, and this is mentioned in the blurb, that there's room for analysis, there's room for interpretation. We're not just saying what we see, but we're going a little bit deeper and adding a little more detail. It also, at the bottom, I like when it talks about when educators are gathering evidence of children's thinking, it's important for them to have a method in place for organizing it and for identifying the trends, patterns, and next steps. And this is what's emerging in the chat right now. I love to see people sharing their ways of gathering and collecting this data. A little later on in this presentation, I'm going to show one of the ways that I collect and identify these trends and patterns. So hopefully that's something that proves helpful. I do think it's important to highlight, why are we talking about PedDoc? Why is it important? And I like this. It comes straight from Growing Success, the kindergarten addendum. It says, Documenting the evidence of learning is the most important aspect of assessment in kindergarten and is indeed an integral part of all assessment approaches. So right here, Growing Success is telling us quite clearly that documenting the evidence of learning is the most important aspect of assessment in kindergarten. I'm hoping we can take some time into chat, or if anyone would like to turn their microphone on and give us their thinking around why is pedagogical documentation so important. Yeah, so Christina's letting us know it makes the thinking and learning visible. It really highlights. I've always loved the idea of noticing and naming learning. Noticing and naming the learning, there we go. To make the learning meaningful to both educator and child. I love that. Yeah, Karen, it helps with planning where to go next. For sure, it's a fabulous way of tracking the progress of our students. I love that, Amanda. Documenting is the backbone of kindergarten. This is great. I mean, we are all definitely in agreement that pedagogical documentation is of the utmost importance. And a lot of the pieces I actually listed on my slide have emerged in the chat. The first piece I listed is that it allows us to gain further insight into children's learning, to think about the thinking and the knowledge and the understanding that we see happening in their play every day. It then provides us meaningful moments of evidence for authentic assessment, and I saw some people in chat mentioning the communication of learning documents. So it really gives us data that we can utilize on those documents. As well, this emerge, it clarifies the potential next steps for learning. I think it assists in our planning process. We're not going home scratching our head thinking, where do we go from here? Because the students, when we really listen to them and tune into their learning, they show us the direction they're moving in, and we're there to facilitate. It encourages us to truly listen to our students. I love the idea of slowing down and really listening to where they're at. Oh, Melanie just said that in the chat. Great thinking, Melanie. Slow down and really listen. I love that. And I think what we will agree is in many ways it makes our jobs as educators easier. So we're not, looking at assessment and planning as these separate spheres, but documentation really brings it all together. And at this point, I'm going to switch to this slide because I think it highlights it really nicely. This comes from Interaction Imagination, which is a fabulous blog by Suzanne Axelson. If you haven't been on it, I can't recommend it enough. But I wanted to include this in tonight's presentation because I think it really highlights that cycle of documentation and why as educators it's so meaningful for us. So we look at the idea of collecting data, of observing, and we move to analyzing, gaining perspective, talking to those involved. And that allows us then, in turn, to make decisions based on this analysis, and that's our planning. Which brings us to the act of doing, the provocation, the activity, the lesson, the conversation. And I love that it comes back to then collecting that data. To me, it's a cycle. Something I always have liked to say when asked why is it important, something I'm constantly saying is that pedagogical documentation is a form of advocacy for play-based learning. I'm hoping we can think about that statement right now and in the chat or on mic, respond to your thoughts on that. Pedagogical documentation is a form of advocacy for play-based learning. And I'm going to have a sip of water because I'm talking a lot. Hmm. Great, awesome. Thank you all for being so active in the chat. This was really great to hear from all of you. Hmm. I would agree with all these statements. I mean, this is something that I love to say because, and again, I'm preaching to the choir, we know the very, very real learning that happens in play. But for some other educators or families or staff members who may not be as familiar with our new Ontario kindergarten program, it's easy for them to look at what we do as just play. And for me, it's so much more. And when we engage in the act of documenting and pedagogical documentation and then share that with others, it really highlights the very real learning that's happening, and it allows others to see that it is more than just play. We're going to move our conversation towards what pedagogical documentation might look like. And I purposefully use what might it look like, what not what does it look like, because I will say this again because I think it's very important. There's not a right way or a wrong way. You find a way that works for you and you try something new. So this is a great visual. It comes from, again, the monograph, Ways to Capture Thinking. They talk about video, which we're going to discuss later today. Photos is a great one. I love thinking about artifacts and products, especially in kindergarten. I haven't done much in the way of audio and transcripts, but I find that really interesting as a way to capture and document student conversations. Audio to share reading with parents. Jessica, I love that idea. What a great idea. I'm going to borrow that. Thanks, Jessica. Learning stories. Learning stories are great. And the idea of documentation panels, they're a little bit more time, but they're really meaningful. I feel like I've said this a few times tonight, but as you can see, it's pretty important to me. I don't feel there's a right or wrong way to collect documentation. For me, the most important part is that you are doing it. And you'll find what works for you, what works for your teaching team, I think most importantly, your students and their families. We're going to move along to look at some specific examples from my own practice, and there will be time throughout to hear from you. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you because so far the chat has been so meaningful. The first examples I wanted to share are the idea of collecting photographs to use for pedagogical documentation. For me, photographs are great. They're quick and easy to capture in the moment. In our classroom on the island, we have a few mini iPads that we use in our classroom. And it's really important to us that the children know that they're not there for, apps and games. We talk a lot about using our iPads as learning tools. And I also talk about them with the students because I don't want them to feel like I'm in their face with a screen and they don't really know why. So we talk a lot about using the iPad to capture their learning and to share with families. So in this first photograph, you see 3 students working together. We had a challenge the other day on how tall they could build a structure using the materials from our MSI card. And for me, this photograph is great. Faces are blurred, of course, to protect privacy. That's something we do when we tweet out our photographs to share with our families. But what I see here as I look at that photo is evidence of teamwork. I love to see how these students are working together to really get that tower as tall as it could be. And I see a great deal of problem solving with these 2 students who have brought over chairs to stand on. Can you guys see, when I put a finger on the screen like that, can you see it? Just let me know in the chat. I want to make sure that that's working. Oh, look at all those yeses. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This second photograph I've included was at our loose parts table where we noticed a child engaging in the act of pattern making. And I really like this idea of capturing through a photograph what may have traditionally been done on a photocopied worksheet. So once upon a time, we may have given a child a piece of paper, black and white, photocopied out of the back of a book, show me a pattern. But I think we would all agree in this room that's not necessarily the most meaningful, authentic, and certainly engaging style of learning. So documentation is great because we're capturing these moments in hands-on learning, which I think is much more meaningful for our students. Photographs are something I'm snapping every day in our classroom as the learning, as you know, unfolds all around us at a rapid pace. To kind of add an additional layer to our documentation, it's really important to include student voice along with these photographs. And I find that sometimes capturing a snippet of what's being said can uncover a little bit more thinking. I'm going to pause for a second because Sherry is letting me know she's not hearing anything. Is that just Sherry, or can no one hear me?
Yes, I think it's just Sherry. So go ahead, Joel, and I'll write to her.
Thank you so much, Susan. So here we have a child in our class who was drawing a face, but when I included the student voice, those little dots I drew are the pupils. To me, that uncovers a little bit of deeper thinking that may not have been evident just with a photo. And this is why I really like to use photos paired with student voice. You can see over here, I made this for near the quiet corner, which is an area in our classroom where we think about self-regulating, because it's about our feelings, happy, sad, and nervous. So without that student's voice, I can look at the artifact, I can look at what she drew and gain some of that. But adding that student voice kind of provides another layer in the pedagogical documentation. A few more examples from student voice here. This one over here, recently this year, our Play-Doh center, where we were working on some fine motor tasks, quickly became a bakery. We found the students constantly were making cookies and selling them to their friends. So we worked with them to create a Room 109 bakery in our own class. And I committed one day to just sitting myself near the bakery and capturing things that were said. So these are snippets of conversation that came up. The menu and information can go here. We've got an order for hot chocolate right up. We're open till Sunday. So I snapped a few photos, but on this day, I worked a little harder on listening to their voice. And this allowed me to see what sort of things they were thinking about, what they were representing in their play, and then what I as an educator could provide for some next steps. What other materials I could place there to spark further learning. Who wants a cookie? I sure do. I'll flip forward to our next example from practice, which is the idea of video. And when I think about student voice, as powerful and necessary as it is, something that I find in my own practice is sometimes the act of capturing student voice can feel a little tedious. And the problem that I sometimes have with it, or actually often have with it, is that I then feel like I'm glued to the keyboard if I'm typing it, or if I'm writing it on a clipboard, I'm glued to that clipboard and I'm kind of frantically writing down everything that's being said. And for me, I find it takes me out of the moment. I try as hard as I can to be present in these moments. I think, it's very important to me, and likely all of us, to really look a child in their eyes when they're speaking to us. So I found that sometimes frantically collecting student voice can be challenging in that regard. And for me, this is where the idea of video comes in and has been so meaningful. I will say, aside from photographs, I'm really using video most often, and certainly in the last couple of years as I fine-tune my own thinking towards pedagogical documentation, video has been so meaningful in capturing these moments, but also allowing me to be present and not feel like I'm just, chained to that clipboard with my pencil. In this specific example, this is just a screenshot from a video. This is something I set up the iPad just on a stand at our sensory table. This was a STEM challenge we set up after reading Iggy Peck Architect, and they were to use a variety of materials to construct a way to get Iggy Peck across the body of water. So what I did is I placed the iPad there on video, and again, I'm always speaking with students about why I'm capturing their learning. This is something that they're very aware of, and I was able to then move to the other parts of the room, facilitate learning elsewhere, observe and document elsewhere, and then return to this video later. And it's so fascinating to return to the video later because you really see things that you had no idea were even happening. It kind of casts a wide net. I mean, I said earlier, and I'll say it again, the learning comes so fast and furious in kindergarten that sometimes we feel like we can't keep up. And for me, video has been so meaningful. I don't always set it up. Sometimes I'll be holding the iPad in my hand, and if I see something specific, I'll just turn the video on to capture it. If I feel like the conversation is really rich and I don't want to write it all down in the moment, I can go back to the video later and I can listen to the conversation. Video is really great too because in the idea of pedagogical documentation, we talk a lot about analyzing the data we're collecting and interpreting the data we're collecting. And video allows us to do that really well, especially with multiple lenses. Often my teaching partner Cheryl and I will look at a video and we'll talk about it after, and what's neat is we will have seen and noticed completely different things. And then we'll show the video to the students, and they will see and notice completely different things. Karen asked, when do you have the time to analyze all the videos, which is a very, very valid question. It is an additional time. I would say my teaching partner and I try to find those moments wherever we can. If we have 5 minutes here or there, we'll review the video. Sometimes we'll do it after school. Christina, I like to use the markup feature in the Camera Photos app. Oh, I never heard of that feature, but I would echo your sentiment that there are often pop-ups in Pic Collage. Markup allows us to record right on the photo. Thank you, Christina. That's new to me, and I'm very excited to look into that tomorrow. I like that this slide comes next because we're talking about the idea of time, and certainly collecting documentation is a time commitment. I find that including the students in the act of collecting and analyzing documentation is a real time saver. But more importantly than that, having the students document their own work really builds a sense of pride in their learning and certainly ownership over their learning. So you can see in this first image here, we have a student who's utilizing one of our classroom iPads to photograph some structure building on our building carpet. But it always doesn't have to be iPads. I purposely chose this photograph over here because students are documenting their thinking and learning on clipboards with pencils. So to give a little bit more context for this image, what you see on the table, this was done in about October of this year. And they refer to it as the town of tape. So utilizing a roll of tape that they found at our art studio, they created this entire network of roads. You can see they drew arrows on it to represent their spatial thinking, which was really neat to see. We found a lot of math behaviors were emerging. Eventually they created parks and parking lots and stores and a sign. It was the town of tape. Before the town of tape moved on, as interests do in kindergarten, we asked students to draw the town of tape for a documentation binder. And you see that documentation binder here. This lives in our classroom now, and it's the story of the town of tape by room 109. So this documentation was done by the students for the students. Over here you see the images that they drew. Those are all inside the binder. I also sat in small groups with students, and we looked at some of the photographs I had captured of the process of putting the town of tape together. And they added some student voice telling me what they were working on. This piece of documentation, like I said, it lives in our room. Often, every day, I see students getting it off the bookshelf and looking at it together, talking about it, and it's that idea that they're engaging in the act of pedagogical documentation, revisiting their learning and talking about what took place. Hi, Marianne. Yes, yeah, absolutely, I agree. It's so neat to see what the students document. And sometimes I will look at the iPad at the end of the day and there's things going on in the classroom that I didn't even catch the first time around. So including students in the act of documenting really gives you such an interesting lens into their learning from their own perspective, and it really casts a wider net. And some of these moments that may have been fleeting are then captured. Yes, revisiting is important. I would agree that that's something on my own learning journey of documentation. I'm trying to get better at the act of revisiting documentation. It's so meaningful, that metacognition piece, and it can spark further learning. Yeah, Jessica, it sparks interest too, absolutely. There are some more examples here of including students in the documentation, and it's come up already. We utilize an app called Pic Collage, although certainly tomorrow, thank you to this chat, I will be looking at markup in the photo app. I'm really interested to check that out. Pic Collage has been great, aside from the pop-ups. It allows us to put several photographs into one in a collage. We often use it when we're tweeting photos for families. It allows them to see more of what went on. But what's been great for us is we then can add the student voice directly on it. Sometimes they'll dictate it to us, and we will type it. But for students who are ready, we encourage them to do a little bit of their own writing. So over here you see the people are eating rainbow pie. This is the kitchen, and the chef is making rainbow pie. Over here, going back to the bakery example I mentioned earlier, we challenged students to make a mixer. They kept telling us when I asked them, what do we need for the bakery? we need a mixer. So we use some of our materials to build mixers, and this student labeled his drawing this way. The final example from practice I wanted to share is the idea of documentation panels. And I purposefully didn't put any images on this page because I wanted to stop for a second here and just as a disclaimer, clarify that this is not something I'm doing for every single learning moment. Putting together panels of documentation can be a little more time consuming, and although I think it is very important and plays a very significant role in the act of noticing and naming the learning, and as I mentioned earlier, looking at documentation as advocacy for play-based learning, I think it's very important. It does take some additional time, so I wanted to pause here and just clarify this is not something I'm doing for learning moments from every day. This is something I use sparingly as it emerges. And I love that in the chat. I think about why am I putting up panels? Who is it for? Some moments lend themselves better to a simple photograph, a snippet of conversation, and some moments, depending on the content, the purpose, the audience, lend themselves better to the idea of a panel. So I'll flip forward next to these examples. These are 4 panels I put together earlier this year, and my intent behind it was to clarify for myself, other staff members, and for families, because this was shared with them, the 4 frames of learning that we find in our Ontario kindergarten program. So over one day, I tried to capture an image that I felt represented each frame. So you see here we've got belonging and contributing, and self-reg and well-being. At the top of the panel, I included a snippet from the program. I have a photograph, and underneath I have my own sort of retell of what happened in that situation. And at the bottom, I do link it directly to the program with some specific expectations. So I will say again, because I think it's important, this is not something I'm doing for every single learning moment because it is an additional time commitment. But in this sense, I felt it was important to clarify for myself, other staff members, and families what these 4 frames are all about. So I'll flip forward. You see we've got one for literacy and mathematics behaviors and another one for problem solving and innovation. This little guy created a kite that he attached directly to his finger so he wouldn't have to hold on to it. Because I don't even have to hold my kite with my hand because it's attached to me. So this was neat. This was tweeted out on our classroom Twitter, which I will link to later. So it was shared with families so that later in the year when they get that communication of learning document, they have a little more idea around what these 4 frames are. And certainly for me, it provided me with some additional learning on what these 4 frames look like in action. I'm just checking through the chat. I love the idea of documentation binders. It's so great for the kids to look at. And again, it gives them that pride and that ownership over their learning. It's something that's in their hands. Good setup for Welcome to Kindergarten Night, absolutely. Yes, Susan, it explains to new families what the early years learning looks like. For me, this really highlights what I said earlier about PedDoc being a form of advocacy for play-based learning, really highlighting that there is so much learning happening in our play-based environments. At this point, I'm hoping to hear from you, and although we've been so active in the chat, and again, I really appreciate that, you may recall during her intro, Susan shared with us how we can enter text on the page. If you look at your toolbar, it is the 4th one down with an A. If you click on it, you're able to actually enter text directly on the screen. Does everybody see my text? Oh, there we go. Someone's already in there. Yeah, so I'm hoping to hear from you. How do you document? I shared a few examples, photos, videos, student conversations, capturing voice, involving them in the process. If people are interested in sharing, you can add a text box to our screen right now, and everyone is able to see it. I believe that ding means someone's put their hand up. I'm scrolling down my list. See who it is. I don't see a hand up unless I missed it. If someone has a question, feel free to add it to the chat. I will keep my eyes over there. So in the chat box, Twyla has shared a concern, and I think it's an extremely valid concern and one certainly that I agree with. Twyla, I'll let you know towards the end of the presentation, we are going to take some time to addressing some of those barriers and challenges with documentation. So we will be getting to that a little later in the presentation, and I'm very thankful you brought it up. Wow, lots of info here on the screen. Thank you so much. This is awesome. Lots of Post-its. Yes, I love it. I agree. Again, I've got those giant Post-its. They've been so great. Photos. I see a lot of photos. I would agree. Photos, for me, are so quick and easy to capture in the moment without feeling like you're kind of attached to that iPad. You know, it allows you to be present. Lots of mentions of OneNote and Google Keep as well. Sketch. Someone has mentioned Sketch over here. That is an app I have used before and really quite like. That's a good one. Voice recordings. He mentions a pic collage. Student writing, samples of student work. I love that. It's really neat to see all the different methods of documentation. I think it really highlights what I think has been a re-emerging theme tonight, which is that, you know, there's not a 1, 2, 3 simple step guide to documentation. There's many ways we can engage in PedDoc in a way that works for us as educators, works for the unique students we work with. Seeing some mentions of portfolios, that's great. I know there's lots of ways to do digital portfolios now as well, but the physical portfolios are great too because a student can kind of revisit those. I'm going to give about 2 more minutes if anyone is hoping to contribute to this slide on how do you document. There's lots of great ideas happening here. It'll take about 2 more minutes. Adrian and Maria. Yeah, raising really great points. If you're the only educator in a class, it can certainly be tricky to capture that documentation. I think for me, I am working in an educator team, so I have another adult in the room, which has been meaningful. But I think including the students in the documentation has been something that really has helped me. You know, giving them the iPads or even the pencils and clipboards as it is, allowing them to kind of capture some documentation for you. I really like Sherry's point. It's a lot of trial and error to figure out what form of documentation will work best for you. And that may change over time. That may change depending on what you're capturing. You know, it's not just one or the other. There's so many options and they all have their own purpose. They all have their own pros. They all have their own cons. It's this idea that we're constantly questioning and learning and trying new things. Shannon, camera's a great idea too. I know an educator who actually has an old Polaroid camera and the students use that. It's really neat to see. They post them on the wall. All right, I am going to be moving along from this slide, but the joy is that this presentation, as we know, is being recorded, so that this slide is now captured. It's our own documentation of our own thinking, and we can revisit it because there's certainly lots of great ideas and perspectives here. Before we move on, I'll put a happy face right there. All right, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your input. As we talk about the idea of pedagogical documentation, I think it's really important to be mindful of some considerations as we move forward in our own understanding of what PedDoc can and should look like. I've created a list here of a few considerations that I try to be mindful of in my work and in my practice. The first that I feel is very important is that we're employing an asset-based lens. And the kindergarten program does a really great job of speaking about children as competent and capable of complex thinking. And I think when we capture moments, it's important that we're really being mindful of the fact that we're looking at it with an asset-based lens, so that we're not looking at, perhaps a moment that might be more chaotic and thinking, oh, they're just messing about, but really remembering that despite what we may be looking at or what it may look like to an outside eye, there is a lot of thinking and learning happening in every moment of our students' day, and it's looking at it with an asset-based lens and thinking, what is happening here? I find that this too helps, and this has come up a lot, the idea that our analysis is coming from multiple lenses. So I mentioned earlier, my partner and I often will view something and we'll notice different things, and it really makes the analysis portion of PedDoc so much richer. A little bit later, we're going to be looking at a video, and this is a video that I've used in presentations before, and I love it because every time I show this video and I ask the participants to take part in analyzing it, someone notices something always that I've never seen in the video. So the idea of multiple lenses, to me, is such a hallmark of pedagogical documentation, and it's certainly something we should consider. I like to always think about the purpose, and this is something that, again, has come up a few times tonight. Someone in the chat said it, and I loved it. Why am I documenting? Why am I documenting this moment? What is the purpose of it? And I think this is something to be mindful of because it prevents us from simply documenting for the sake of documenting. And I will say again, when I started my own learning journey towards this idea, I had piles and piles and piles of paper. But to me, it has to go beyond that. We're not just collecting it. What is the purpose? And I think too, giving ourselves the freedom to recognize that we don't have to document every single moment in our kindergarten day, right? If that's happening, you're never going to get away from it. And we know that there's so much other parts to our day that we need to be present for. So we think a lot about purpose. Why am I documenting this? Or maybe, why am I not documenting this moment? As well, we consider the audience. Documentation for different audiences may help us make certain choices in how we document or how we display the documentation. I think one of those choices is definitely our language. Depending on our audience, we may look at, jargon, edubabble as it is, or maybe we're looking for a more plain, accessible use of our language. And the bottom one here I think is really important. I love to see the check marks and the fingers. Thank you guys for taking part. Is the idea of how do we involve families in the process of pedagogical documentation. So this is not just something for us and our planning and our assessment. This is not just something for our students. This is something for their families. So I'm seeing some chat going on about Twitter. Our school, Island Public School, our kindergarten team uses Twitter, and we've had really great feedback from it. We have 3 kindergarten classes, and we have a shared account, which I'll link to later, but we each have our own hashtag and to differentiate between the 3 rooms. And we utilize Twitter to let families take a look at, through photos and student voice and video clips, what's happening in our classroom. As you may recall from earlier in the presentation, I shared with you that I teach on Toronto Island, and I do take a boat to work. And the majority of our students actually live downtown in the city and also take the boat to school. So we have some students who live on the island, but in our class of 31 this year, 30 of our students actually live in the city. which means that their families are in the city, which means their families don't come on the boat with them. We have travel safety officers who go with our students on the boat. So families are staying in the city, so they're not able to pop up or pop into our classrooms at the end of the day, peek their head in and see what we're doing. So Twitter has been a way to kind of bridge that geographical divide and allow families to feel like they're present in our classrooms and in their students' learning. Yes, Melanie, there was a video of us. The island was flooded last year. It got quite interesting. We were evacuated, but we're back on the island now, and we're very thankful. We're very thankful. I did see a concern about privacy from Kim. Thank you, Kim. I think that's a really important thing to note. When we are sharing documentation through social media, we use Twitter. I know other schools use Facebook. It is an important consideration. So families are signing a waiver at the start of the school to either consent to or to not take part in that media sharing. We do censor all the faces. We blur faces. I mean, most often I try to use photographs that don't have children's faces at all, but if there are faces, we do blur them. We don't use children's names. We use first initials, just as a privacy concern, and I think that's important to mention. Family Friday, I love that. I love that. It's such a great way to share that documentation. Yeah, cropping faces out, for sure. I think it's definitely something to be mindful of, but I don't think that it should stop us from sharing that documentation with families, because we've gotten such positive feedback from our families, and it's really helped them to see the learning that happens in play. Welcome Wednesdays, I love that. I think for me, my biggest consideration when I think about pedagogical documentation is this triangle right here. In fact, we have it posted on our documentation board outside our room, which you'll see a little later. And this is something that I look at daily, and I utilize it as much as I can to guide my own practice as I think about pedagogical documentation and how it's balanced between the three. So this triangle asks us to consider, what are the students doing? What are the students saying? And what are the students representing? And this is through observations, the collection of conversations, and analyzing the products or the artifacts of their work as it is. And I find for me, being mindful of all three of these not only ensures that the documentation is balanced, but it also ensures, that more students are being represented in our documentation. So an example I'll give is if we're leaning too heavily on what are students saying, and I'm certainly guilty of this from time to time, we may not be capturing the learning of our English language learners, for example. Or there was a year I had a student who was nonverbal, and I had to think very carefully about not just capturing what they're saying, but also what they're doing, what they're representing. I find if we lean too far one way, we're missing a lot of the complex thinking that's happening. So for me, this is a consideration I look at when I'm thinking about pedagogical documentation, is trying to find a balance between what students are doing, saying, and representing. We're going to look at how we connect our pedagogical documentation to the kindergarten program and the overall and specific expectations that we have within our 4 frames of learning. So the image you're seeing here is kind of where I began my journey as I delved into the new kindergarten program and looking at a way to kind of collect and track and analyze this documentation. So this was a board that my teaching partner at the time and I put up in our classroom, and we devoted 1/4 of the board to each one of the 4 frames. As you can see, we were using sticky notes. There are those sticky notes again. And when we noticed something happening or we heard something being said, we would jot it on a sticky note and place it in whichever of the 4 frames we felt it corresponded to. Beside it, we actually had a printed out copy of the expectations. Given that the kindergarten program was new, we also looked at this as a way to kind of familiarize ourselves with those expectations. Now, I will say this is where I started. This is not where we are now, but I want to show it because I really do believe that learning is a journey and that we never stop. So what I found as we started with this process, the first thing I noticed is that as we went through the expectations and decided which of the 4 frames the observation was going to go in, we started to see, as we uncovered more of the program, there was a great deal of overlap between the 4 frames. And I think we would all agree, certainly in the process of writing our communication of learning documents, that it's not always one frame or the other. The majority of our expectations in our program actually exist in multiple frames. And as you may know, there are some expectations that actually exist in all 4 frames. So I felt that it made sense that this is kind of where my brain first went. I think as educators, we kind of have this desire to pick things apart and compartmentalize and sort. But I found that it became tricky for me of which frame does this go in if the expectation I'm seeing is actually demonstrating belonging and contributing, but also a literacy behavior. Or perhaps I've noticed something at the building carpet that's demonstrating problem solving and innovation, but also belonging and contributing. Maybe I see something that has 3 frames in it. So this is where we started, and this is where we are at now. I have an in-depth blog post on my blog about the process of putting together this board. I will link to it at the end, but I'm going to talk briefly about it before we move on. I created this 4-part Venn diagram after my realization that so many of the expectations and behaviors we see in kindergarten overlap between the 4 frames. So you can see here each frame, we have belonging and contributing, self-reg and well-being, demonstrating literacy and mathematics behaviors, and problem-solving innovation. Each have their own area, but there are areas where they overlap between 2, between 3 frames, and in the center we have all 4 frames. If I could do this again in my learning journey, I would actually make the center be the biggest part, because I find that the majority of things we're observing and tracking in our documentation exist within the overlap. There's less and less we see that is actually just one of the 4 frames. So this board, it's outside our room, it's our documentation board, and we use it to track what we see. We use it to consider next steps and further planning. We use it to analyze trends in their learning. So what's neat to see is throughout the year, there's certain areas that are more populated than others. So for example, at the start of the year, belonging and contributing is often an area where we see lots. As the year goes on, we tend to see more literacy and mathematics behaviors. So it allows us, as you know, to use the term again, teachers as researchers, we can look at our own data we're collecting and think about, where is this coming from? I see a few questions I'm going to address quickly in the chat. Where do we put this? So this board is outside our classroom. It's in the hallway outside our classroom, but what's neat is that's where our students line up for lunch. So as I update it, and I want to be clear, I'm not updating this board daily. My partner and I will say monthly, but not always, we'll print out some of the photographs, put up artifacts of their work, write out snippets of conversation, and then work together to sort it between the 4 frames. I see the question, do parents see this bulletin board? So again, with our unique location on the island, unfortunately parents aren't in our school every day. When parents do visit and we look at having that happen as often as we can, we encourage them to take a look. Parents know about it, and I do tweet this out. Someone mentioned the blog. Yes, I do have a more detailed blog about the process behind this. Hopefully that addressed those conversations. So like I said, this is where we're at now, but it's not a perfect system. You know, I would look at making those center areas a little bit bigger. But for me, what's worked with this is it honors the overlap between the 4 frames. I found it didn't really feel natural or authentic to pick it apart and put it into one frame only when so much of our program looks at the overlap. And what's nice about this versus just the sticky notes is we can include photographs of what they're doing. We can include written artifacts of what they're representing, and we can include written blurbs of what they're saying, the conversations they're having. I also will mention it becomes very helpful to have a system like this, whether it's, like I've done, an actual board or even something online. I know that people are saying here, yeah, Seesaw, exactly. You can do hashtags for the frames, and that allows you to track them. So whatever system works for you, whether it's in real life on a wall or on an app, I find that having a method to track, to look at trends, to collect your data in one place is so meaningful when it comes time for communication of learning. Because we've got all this data here, whether it's here or on an app, that tells us what the students are thinking about within each frame of learning, and it allows us to really flesh out the assessment. Yes, Kim, time. It's a big one, and it's actually coming up here on the next slide. Perfect timing, Kim. Thank you. So I wanted to take some time tonight because I think this is very important to acknowledge that there are often, for all of us, barriers and challenges that can get in the way of the act of pedagogical documentation. I think as educators, we have to talk about that, we have to be honest about that, and we have to confront those. So for me, I thought tonight we could highlight some of these barriers, but I feel very strongly that we don't, and I'm sure you would all agree, we don't live in that area of just simply highlighting the barriers. We move beyond it to looking at solutions. And what I think is so neat about this webinar is that there's now, oh, look at that, there's 74 of us in the room right now who bring our own knowledge and experience to the chat tonight. So I don't only want to highlight these barriers, but I'm hoping to crowdsource some solutions from all of you with what has worked, what you've found in your practice, how you've addressed these barriers and challenges. So please, please, please let us know in the chat. Again, if anyone wants to turn their microphone on, you can join me. Debbie's asked, will we get a copy of the slide? So Debbie, it is being recorded, and you can, thank you, Susan. You're able to view the recording after the fact. So yeah, don't worry about writing everything down. You will see a recording. Awesome. So we are going to look at 3 barriers, and I've selected 3 that I found come up when I speak with other educators about pedagogical documentation, and it's interesting because a lot of them have come up tonight. So as I present all 3, remember we're looking at crowdsourcing some solutions. So please, in the chat, let us know ways you've addressed these challenges, and ways you found to move past them effectively, because we can learn from one another. So the first, and I knew this would come up, time. And it's a very valid concern. Documentation takes time. Is there anyone in the chat who's willing to share with us how they address the challenge of time in documentation? There's a bit of a pause, but I'm sure it's because people are typing very detailed and meaningful answers. Ooh, do we have any microphones on? See an arrow by class size. Yes, absolutely. So I see in the chat the mention of partnership, and I think if you are in an educator team, I think utilizing your partnership is definitely one of, in my mind, the best ways to get around the idea of time. Yes, Amanda, 1 up, 1 down. This is a term that myself and my partner use. I heard it from Tracy Sims and Cheryl Emmerich in the Waterloo board, and it's the idea that if one educator is down at a focused provocation documenting that moment, the other educator is up, moving around the room and facilitating as needed. I love that. Oh, look at all these answers coming fast and furious. I love it. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Oh, great. So Lori has suggested writing point form sticky notes in the moment and then elaborating on the observations later when she has more time. I love that. Yeah, I see a lot of 1 up, 1 down. One writes while the other wanders. I like that, Patricia. Natalia's mentioned a checklist, trying to visit 5 kids a day. And I do like that you mentioned the spontaneous ones, because I think more often than not, that's when the the real rich learning surprises us. Checklist to make sure every child is documented. Yeah, I'm gonna show you an example from our practice, a similar idea. Great. Well, these are some fabulous solutions. Thank you all. Yeah, focusing on one area. And I think it comes back, and I mentioned it earlier, the idea that we don't have to document everything. And this is definitely something that in my own learning I've had to think about, is this idea that we feel like we have to capture every moment. But really, the reality is that's not realistic. But I would also argue it's not necessary, for sure. I'm going to move towards the second barrier that I've listed here, which is the lack of tech. So a lot of my own examples came from iPads, photographs, videos, but I think it's important to recognize that not all classrooms and not all educators and students have access to that technology. So with the lack of technology, who has some solutions for how we can get around that and still look at collecting meaningful pedagogical documentation? Patricia, I'm not familiar with the at-a-glance grid. If you're able to give us a little more info in the chat, I am interested in hearing more about that. Yeah, we come back to sticky notes. It doesn't have to be on tech. Yeah, I think that's important to acknowledge. Cue cards on a clipboard, fabulous. Yeah, we have an educator on our kindergarten team who doesn't enjoy using iPads. It's not something she's really familiar with, and she does all of her documentation through note-taking, and that's something that's worked for her. It comes back to that idea that you find what works for you, and it may not be tech for all of us. There's not one single way to document. Thank you, Susan, for keeping me on track. I appreciate it. I'm happy you're here. It is 8:40. We've got about 20 minutes left, so we're going to zoom through. Checklist, 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 for sure. And I think actually that leads us very nicely to the final barrier, which is class size. Do people in chat want to just say how many students they have? We're at 31. I know there's some of us, 28, 27. Ooh, look at all these numbers. I know some of us are working on our own without a teaching team. So numbers are a bit smaller, but that comes with its own challenges, I know. (31, 17 JK). So certainly I do think that class size can be a barrier. I wanted to flip to this next slide now, because this is something that my teaching partner, Sheila, who I worked with for the previous 3 years, did together when we felt the concern, as we talked about it, that not all of our students in our large class may be showing up in documentation, and we wanted to think about equity. We asked ourselves who is being documented, but more importantly, who is not. Again, this is not something we did constantly. This was about a 1-month project. We looked at it as documenting our own documentation. We wanted to uncover our biases, because every documenter has a bias of what we capture and who we capture and why. So for a month, in week-long periods, we had a class list, and Google Forms will also give this data. Thank you. I've got to get on Google Forms. I'm a little old school with my paper and pen. I am a millennial, but I'm not as high-tech as I probably could be. But this is what works for me. So we, for each student, would track what we were documenting. So we have a few different areas. in the room, and we were also looking at if we were using photo, video, or student voice, just to give us an idea of, in our large class, not just who was being represented, but what sort of behaviors. And this was so meaningful for us, and we did, and I will speak quite honestly, we found that some students weren't turning up in documentation as much as others, and this is something that we really had to talk about. We're not ashamed to say it because we tackled it head on and we thought about why is this happening. And I think what emerged for us, and likely has come for many of us, is that certain students, based off their personalities or, their talkative personalities may turn up more often. I want to be clear, I don't think it's true that it has to be perfectly even. I don't think I have to say, at the end of this week, every student is represented the same amount of times. I don't think that's authentic. I don't think that's meaningful. Some students will appear more than others, but as long as we're mindful moving forward, I think it keeps us on track and more balanced. Great ideas in the chat. So looking at days of the week for specific students, I love it. I try to stay on the fly as much as I can because, I don't want to miss something just because I'm hyper-focused elsewhere. I think spontaneity is very important as well. It's all about balance. We have come to the end in the consolidation portion of our learning from tonight. And I'm hoping that we can look at a video all together and using what we've talked about, using all the perspectives we've taken tonight, engage in the act of pedagogical documentation. Some context for the video clip we are going to be looking at. It came from our classroom last year. Students were making their own Play-Doh. They were interested. A student came to us one day and asked, how do I make Play-Doh? So my teaching partner, Sheila, at the time, sat down with him one-on-one, and together they researched it, and they created a recipe book using photographs and writing. And this recipe book lived in our class along with the ingredients, and students were able to use this documentation that one student put together to create their own Play-Doh. The first time we watch the video, we are going to watch it twice. It's only about 1 or 2 minutes. The first time we watch the video, I'm going to ask you to simply focus on what we see. So at this point, we're not going to be making interpretation because I'm hoping to see that by reviewing videos multiple times, the layers start to emerge. So after the video, we will discuss our observations, and I think a good prompt to guide us, our first viewing is going to be, what did you see in the video? I'll let you know that the second time we'll watch the video, we're going to focus more on interpretation and analysis of what we see. Again, we'll return here to discuss our thoughts, and some prompts for our second viewing, maybe what do you notice? What learning do you see present? And a follow-up to that is, how do you know? What evidence of the 4 frames do you see? And what do you wonder? And possibly what might some possible extensions be? So quick recap, because I'm keeping an eye on the time. We will view the video twice. The first time, simply what you see. The second time, what you notice. After watching it once, come on back, because we are going to share what we saw, and then we'll return to the video a second time. The video link is here, and I know that Susan has it and can perhaps even copy it.
So I've just put the video link into the chat because the link on the screen is just a screenshot of Joel's slide, so that won't work. So when you click on the link in the chat, it will open the video up in a browser. So you'll have the Blackboard window and you'll have your browser. So watch the video and then come on back to Blackboard. And as Joel mentioned, click the green check mark when you're back. I'm going to switch that back to checkmark X.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Susan. So yeah, let's take a look at that video now with the question, what do you see? And we'll return at the end of the video, click the check mark, and then we'll have a quick discussion. Awesome. So I see some of us are back on Blackboard. If you're here, you can click that green check mark so we know you're back. Let us know in the chat, or even adding text to the screen is a lovely idea. The prompt was, what did you see? So we're not analyzing, we're not interpreting yet. We will do that on our second viewing. Yes, Lori, the self-advocating piece. Can you please take your hands off of me? Very polite, very respectful. And we talk a lot about respect, so that's always a nice one to hear. I show this video in a lot of my presentations, and that line is always commented on. So people see looking at the binder for what goes into making Play-Doh. People are seeing lots of hands involved. Jillian sees flipping through the recipe binder. On the screen here, people are seeing lots of language. Yes, the line, "it's getting goopier," is very interesting. Yeah, this here is a very nice observation. We're not analyzing, we're not interpreting yet. It's simply, what do we see first? So 3 children standing at the counter with a bowl, mixing ingredients together and reading the directions. 2 children mixing, 3rd joins. So Monica sees 1 student adding many extra scoops of flour. When I show this video to non-educators, they always are a little stressed out by that part. So much scooping, yes, yes. So these are great observations, and this is a great start for our pedagogical documentation. We're going to go back and watch the link one more time, and this time when you watch the video, I'm going to flip back a few slides. Oh, my apologies if anyone's still typing. The prompts we're going to look at now are, what do you notice? What learning do you see present? How do you know? What evidence of the 4 frames do you see? What do you wonder? And what might a possible extension be? So if anyone wants to give that link a second view and then return, I've given us a new screen here for what do you notice. This is the analysis portion. Go ahead and watch that video a second time. So I can see some of us are returning to Blackboard to share our analysis and to share our interpretation. Amanda sees evidence of problem solving, for sure. And it's getting goopier, and then linking that to the addition of more flour. Melanie, I like that you mentioned fine motor development in the mixing. Again, this is so great to see that different people notice different things. There's evidence of collaboration, for sure. I like this. An extension is using language around texture. Yeah, goopier. There's so much more we can do with that. Evidence of early literacy skills, absolutely. Give people about 1 more minute to add to the slide or let us know in the chat. What did you notice upon the second viewing of that video? Patricia saw all 4 frames. Interesting. Yeah, it's that overlap that we were talking about earlier. Sharon's mentioning noticing calm voices and no one really getting upset, so perhaps there's some connections to the self-reg and well-being piece happening here. Changes from liquid to solid, there's so many connections we can make. So what's so interesting about this act of pedagogical documentation, with all 70 of us together, is that between all of us, so many different perspectives were shared, so many different things were noticed, and this really highlights, and I'll say it again, the need for looking carefully at our documentation with multiple lenses, involving multiple viewers in the process of analyzing and interpreting our PED doc. It really makes it so much richer and ensures that we're thinking about things that we may not have noticed the first time around. That's why I find this activity so meaningful. And as well, to bring it back to advocacy for play-based learning, these moments of learning, if we're not capturing them, they can be fleeting. So I think it's important to really highlight this learning, to notice it, to name it, and then in the active PED doc to share it with others. Yeah, Christine, it's a simple activity. It's nice to do with a kindergarten team. If everyone in your school wants to bring one video, during a PLC meeting and sit down and talk with each other and look at the videos on each other's devices and share, what do you notice? What might the next steps be? It's really what provides rich and meaningful analysis of PED doc. Awesome. I'm going to flip to the next slide. I'm just hoping no one is in the middle of writing. But fabulous, fabulous analysis and so meaningful. Thank you all for taking part. Our final thought, we started with a quote, and I do like to end with a quote. And this one comes to us from Susan Stacy. She says, through documentation, we move from describing the children's work to reflecting on what it might mean, to considering the possibilities for response, to responding in ways that might involve the hearts and minds of both children and teachers. And I wanted to kind of have that as our final takeaway for the night, because I really like what Susan Stacy is saying there. That's just about it for me. Again, before I go, I want to thank all of you for being so active in tonight's chat. I said off the top, I didn't want it to be just my voice, and it was so meaningful to see all your perspectives shared in the chat and on the screen. So thank you all for being here. It was a learning experience for myself as well. I'm taking away so much from tonight. Thanks to all of you. The resources are here on the slide, and I see that Susan has shared them as well in the chat. Awesome, thank you so much. So the program, of course, Growing Success, those 2 monographs I mentioned, they're all accessible online. The last one there that comes from Susan Stacy, it's a book, Pedagogical Documentation in Early Childhood. I cannot recommend it enough. It's a fabulous one. The last slide I'm going to show you is contact info for me if anyone's interested. I referenced it a few times. I document my own learning journey as a kindergarten educator on my blog. It's wideeyesandwonder.blogspot.com, and you'll see some of the examples shared tonight up there if you're interested in digging a little deeper into some of the stuff I talked about. I'm also on Twitter at Joel Seaman, and Twitter is so fabulous for connecting with other educators. It's been such a great tool for me to be inspired by educators not only across Ontario but the world. So please reach out at Joel Seaman on Twitter if you're interested in connecting. As well, our classroom account can be found at IPS Kindergarten. It's shared between our 3 kindergarten classes. Our hashtag is Room109 if you're looking for some examples from practice. That's it for me. It was a great night of learning. Hopefully you all found it meaningful and purposeful and you're taking something away. I know I certainly enjoyed my time, so thank you very much.
That was an amazing evening, just fantastic. Thank you so much, Joel. First webinar, OTF Connects, won't be your last. I'm pretty sure, I can guarantee that. And thank you to all of you for your great participation tonight. You did a wonderful job of sharing and questioning and responding to Joel's prompts. So thank you so much, Joel. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording and talk a little bit about feedback and follow-up to tonight. But once again, a big thank you to all of you, and we'll say good night.